Hello, I'm Cameron Otts, and today we'll be asking 3 different questions about 3 different companies. The companies I picked were Hornbeck Offshore, Activision Blizzard, and Ubisoft. And the 3 questions we will be asking are who would I make a short-term loan to, long-term loan to, and who would I purchase. We will be using various financial statements and financial equations in order to make an educated decision based on how a company spends their money and how much debt they've already accrued and paid off. Now for the first question, who would I give a short-term loan to, we will be using 3 equations. Our cash ratio, current ratio, and quick ratio. Our cash ratio is cash over assets, which shows us our percentage of cash for assets. Our current ratio is current assets over current liabilities, which is the same for current assets over liabilities. And then we have our quick ratio, which is very similar to our current ratio, which is current assets minus inventory over current liabilities. This alleviates the problem by removing inventory which might not sell. So if we look at our first company, Activision Blizzard, we see that their cash ratio starts out at 5 and then drops down to about 1. Likewise, their current ratio starts at 5 and goes to 3. And then their quick ratio starts at 5 and goes to 2. So Blizzard is a digital media company, so they don't have to have too many physical goods to count as inventory, for they just redistribute all their stuff digitally. The same goes for Ubisoft, who we'll talk about next. So Ubisoft's cash ratio is pretty consistent with small fluctuations of around 0.5. And then their current ratio is very similar at 1. And then we see that their quick ratio is again very similar to their current ratio with mild fluctuations around 0.75. We can then look at Hornbeck and see that their cash ratio started out really good at 13 and dropped to about 2. And then we see that their current ratio also started really good at 13 and dropped to around 4. And then we see that their quick ratio started at 4 and dropped down to 1. This can be due to various things, such as needing to have items shipped and whatnot. So as to who I would pick Hornbeck because overall their ratios were much higher than their competitors, and they overall kind of dwindled, but it was a much more understanding sense due to a market crash and whatnot. Now, a good secondary choice, in my opinion, would be Ubisoft, because they have been very consistent, and that is really important, because unfortunately, sometimes people just don't pay due to bankruptcy or stuff like that. So being able to actually get what we paid for is an extremely important thing. So next, we will look at our long term. So we'll also use 3 equations here. We have total debt over EBIT, which is how much debt I have over equity before interest and taxes. And then we have our total debt over total assets. And then we have our actual long-term debt. So if we look at Activision Blizzard, we see something extremely interesting. Throughout all of these tables, we see that they have zeros in the first 6 years, which is phenomenal. And then, so that's all good. But then we see that in their total debt over EBIT, we see that it grows to about 3. And then their total debt over total assets ends up being about 4K. And then we see that the long-term debt ends up being about 30. So overall, starts out good, but then gets pretty high. Next, we look at Ubisoft, and once again, their numbers are fairly consistent. So you have the total debt over EBIT, which is fluctuating around 2. And then you have the total debt over total assets, which starts at about 55 and then kind of goes up and down till it ends up at about 64. And then their total debt starts out at a relatively high 27 and then drops down to around an 8 and then gradually climbs back up to around an 18. So, and then we have Hornbeck, which their total debt over EBIT turns out to start out at 5 and then grow to about 6. And then their total debt over total assets starts off at a fairly high 549, and then grows to about 1,000. And then their long-term debt actually drops from 50 to 36. Now, I would have to go with Ubisoft here because overall they seem really contempt about dealing with their debt, and they have really, they're really able to pay it off. At least the financial statements says so. So now we would answer the following question, which is who would I buy? So for this we will use many equations. We will use the profit margin, which is net income over sales, the return on assets, which is net income over assets, the return on equity, which is net income over equity, and the asset turnover. So if we look at Activision Blizzard, we see that their profit margin starts from a 3 and then grows to about a 7. We see their return on assets grow from a 1 to a 3, and then we see the return on equity do something really interesting. So it starts out at 36, drops down to a 10, and then grows back up again to a 30. Now this is overall a drop. However, it was recovered extremely well by them, and overall the amount wasn't that extreme. And then we see their asset turnover, which drops from 1 to about 0.3. So next we'll look at Ubisoft. Their profit margin started at 1, and then grew to 3. Then we see that their ROA also starts at 1 and grows to 3. So now we get to look at their return on equity, which is really interesting. So according to this, it starts at 1 and grows to about 2.3K. However, there are many missing columns here. So I did some research and I wasn't able to fully analyze on what was the exact cause, so we can only speculate. So through that, we won't be able to get an accurate reading on this category. And then if we look at the asset turnover, we see that it is pretty consistent with minor fluctuations around 0.7. Next, we get to look at Hornbeck. So their profit margin started at 3 and then actually drops to 2. And then their ROA starts at 0.6 and then drops to 0.3. And then we get to see their ROE, which is kind of all over the place. So it starts at a 9.8, so around a 10, and then it grows and dwindles. It grows to about a 32, and then it ends up in 2015 to about a 0.6. So, and then we also get to look at their asset turnover, and it's pretty constant with the minor fluctuations around 0.2. So between these three companies, I would purchase Activision Blizzard because overall, all of these ratios are much higher than the other two companies, and then their return on equity, they seem to have a really good grasp of like when they need to have more or less. So overall, I think that would be a great company choice. So in conclusion, for a short-term loan, I would offer it up to Hornbeck. A long-term loan, I would offer Ubisoft, and I would purchase Activision Blizzard. Thank you so much, and have a great week.